One phone call to the White House was all it took to destroy their careers and show the world that injustice has no hiding place. It was supposed to be just another drive through a sleepy part of Oregon, the kind of place most people only pass through on their way to somewhere else. Colonel Darius Reynolds had made drives like this 100 times before. No security detail, no flashing lights, just him, a rental car, and a deadline. He had a confidential meeting scheduled at Oak Ridge Military Base, and he didn't have time for distractions. But somewhere between Portland and Bend, just outside a tiny town called Riverdale, Darius noticed the signal bars on his secure phone dropping. He needed to make a call, not tomorrow, not in an hour, right now. He spotted an old, half-forgotten gas station, Mercer's Fuel and Market, and pulled into the cracked, uneven lot. It wasn't pretty, but it was enough. Darius parked near the edge of the building, away from the front door where a few locals were gathered, leaning on pickup trucks, swapping stories in the crisp autumn air. He didn't think twice about it. To him, it was just a place to get a quiet minute. He grabbed his secure device, stepped out for better reception, and raised the phone to his ear. Colonel Reynolds, verifying identity, initiating briefing, he said, his voice low and professional. The White House officer on the other end started the briefing immediately. Sensitive movements, real-time orders, things only a handful of people had clearance to hear. Darius kept his eyes moving, casually scanning the lot the way he was trained to, but staying focused on the call. A few people near the gas pump started to glance in his direction. He didn't look like the folks who usually stopped around here, and certainly not someone in authority. Without a badge or uniform, he wore dark jeans, plain boots, a navy blue jacket, and a ball cap pulled low over his close-cropped hair. Ordinary clothes. Nothing that screamed high-ranking military officer, and that was exactly how he wanted it, but not everyone saw it that way. Inside the station, a man named Frank Mercer was watching from behind the counter. Mid-60s, weathered face, permanent scowl from a life spent judging everyone else. Frank didn't see a highly decorated war hero. He didn't even see a man making a phone call. He saw what he wanted to see: trouble. Frank picked up the old landline and called the Riverdale Sheriff's Department. He kept his voice low so the customers wouldn't hear. "Yeah, we got a suspicious man out here by the pumps," Frank said. "Real shady, might be casing the place or something, acting strange. Y'all better come check it out." He hung up before they could ask too many questions. Across town, two deputies heard the call over the radio and exchanged knowing looks. Nothing much ever happened in Riverdale. They didn't mind stirring the pot a little if it broke up the boredom. They threw on their sunglasses, jumped into their cruiser, and sped toward the station. Meanwhile, Darius remained by his car, trying to stay laser-focused on the conversation. The White House was relaying crucial information that couldn't afford to be interrupted, but he had no idea that real trouble was already on its way. Just as Darius reached for his notepad to jot down coordinates, he noticed flashing lights reflecting off the station windows, and everything around him started to shift. The cruiser screeched into the lot, gravel spitting out from under the tires. Darius lowered his phone for a second, squinting at the flashing reds and blues. Two deputies jumped out before the car had even fully stopped. The taller one, Deputy Vanessa Holt, early 30s, blonde ponytail, athletic build, unhooked her holster with a quick flick. The other deputy, Trevor Blackwell, stockier, older, and too eager, mirrored her. Both of them moved like people looking for a fight. Darius felt the air tighten around him. He calmly placed the secure phone on the hood of his car and kept his hands visible, palms open. His voice stayed measured and controlled, just like they taught him at West Point all those years ago. "Good afternoon, officers. How can I help you?" he asked. Holt barked back, "License and registration now." Darius offered a half step forward, reaching slowly for his wallet tucked into his inside jacket pocket. "Absolutely. My ID is right here. I'm active duty military, Colonel Darius Reynolds. I'm on official business." Blackwell scoffed. "Colonel, huh? You expecting us to believe that?" Darius pulled out his military credentials and federal travel orders, extending them toward the deputies with steady hands. Holt snatched them away, barely glancing at the documents before shaking her head. "This is fake," she said, tossing his ID onto the hood like trash. Darius blinked, stunned for the first time. "Ma'am, I assure you." "Shut up," Blackwell snapped. "You think you can play us, buddy? You picked the wrong town for that." A small crowd was beginning to form: customers, station workers, drivers who pulled in for gas and decided to stick around for the free show. Some whispered, some laughed, no one stepped in. Darius's training screamed at him to de-escalate, but every instinct also told him that these deputies weren't looking for answers. They had already decided who he was and, worse, what he wasn't. Darius tried again, his voice low and even. "Please contact your supervisor. You're making a serious mistake." But Holt already had cuffs in her hand. "Turn around, hands behind your back." Darius didn't move. He stood his ground, not in defiance, but because something inside him broke loose, something heavy. "I am a colonel in the United States Army," he said, his voice sharp now. "You are unlawfully detaining me." Holt laughed, actually laughed loud enough that the people watching heard it echo against the pumps. "Yeah, and I'm the Secretary of Defense. Turn around." Before Darius could say another word, Blackwell grabbed his arm roughly, and Holt forced his other wrist behind his back. The cuffs snapped. Tight enough to pinch the skin, Darius clenched his jaw, swallowing the flood of humiliation that rose up hot and fast. Somewhere behind him, the secure phone still connected to the White House clattered to the ground. The voice on the other end, hearing the chaos, started yelling his name, but the deputies didn't notice, or maybe they didn't care. Holt shoved Darius against the side of his rental car, hard enough to rattle the door. Gasps rippled through the small crowd. "Got him," Blackwell said, like they'd just caught a prize. Darius, breathing hard, stared straight ahead at the greasy window of Mercer's Fuel and Market, his reflection fractured into pieces by the dirt and grime. In that moment, he wasn't a colonel. He wasn't even a person to them. He was just someone to be thrown around because they could. But inside the White House Situation Room, alarms were already blaring, and Darius's disappearance wouldn't stay unnoticed for long. Back at the White House, the secure call had gone from strange to alarming in under 60 seconds. Captain Lucia Navarro, sitting behind a wall of monitors in Washington, D.C., stared at the blinking line labeled Reynolds Secure. The audio feed was a mess. Background noise, scuffling sounds, voices shouting words she couldn't quite make out, then nothing but static. Lucia leaned closer to the mic. "Colonel Reynolds, this is Command Operations. Do you copy? Colonel Reynolds, respond." No answer. She glanced up at her supervisor, Director Nathan Caldwell, who was already striding across the floor. "Ping his location," Caldwell ordered. His voice cut clean through the hum of the operations center. Within seconds, a technician pulled up a blinking dot on a map. It was nowhere near the base. He was stalled at a gas station right off Highway 97 in Riverdale, a speck on the map most White House staff had never heard of. Caldwell leaned over Lucia's shoulder, jaw tight. "Get Oak Ridge Security on the line and patch me through to JAG. If something's happened to Darius, we're moving immediately." Meanwhile, back in Riverdale, Darius was sitting on the curb in handcuffs, his back to the wall of the station. "What's your real name?" Holt asked, looming over him like a bad dream. "Who are you working for?" Darius exhaled slowly through his nose. "You have my ID, my travel orders. Everything you need is right there." Blackwell snorted. Buddy, you're about 2 seconds from being booked for obstruction. Don't push it. Darius said nothing. He wasn't going to give them the satisfaction of seeing him beg. Out of the corner of his eye, he caught people pulling out their phones, recording, whispering. Frank Mercer stood by the door with his arms crossed, smirking like he was watching a backyard wrestling match. The whole thing was spinning out of control, and nobody seemed interested in stopping it. Suddenly, Holt's radio crackled to life. Dispatch to Unit 5. Confirm you have detained subject. Holt grabbed the radio off her belt. Affirmative, male, mid-40s, refusing to cooperate. There was a pause then. Be advised, subject is flagged. Federal repeat flagged federal. White House has initiated emergency contact. Release immediately and await further orders. The blood drained from Holt's face. Blackwell dropped his smug grin. What the hell? He muttered. Darius, still sitting there, said nothing. He just stared up at them, waiting. Holt fumbled with her keys, unlocking the cuffs without meeting his eyes. She muttered something that sounded halfway between sorry and sir, but didn't have the backbone to say it properly. Darius stood up slowly, flexing his wrists where the metal had dug into his skin. The crowd was dead silent now. Even Frank's smirk had slipped. Darius picked up his phone from the ground. The screen was cracked, connection lost, sensitive information possibly compromised. He looked at both deputies dead in the eye. You're going to regret this, he said quietly. Not tomorrow, not next week, today. Holt opened her mouth like she was about to argue, but a new set of flashing lights lit up the parking lot. This time it wasn't local deputies. It was a convoy of black SUVs from Oak Ridge Military Base, tires screaming against the asphalt. But Darius wasn't waiting for backup. He was already gathering himself for what needed to happen next. The doors of the black SUVs swung open almost in unison, like something out of a movie, but there was nothing glamorous about the way the officers from Oak Ridge moved. It was pure urgency, no smiles, no greetings, just clipped orders and tight faces. Leading the team was Major Amara Patel, late 30s, sharp-eyed, and not here to make friends. She crossed the lot in long strides, a folder tucked under one arm, her gaze locking immediately on Darius. Colonel Reynolds, are you injured? Patel asked, her voice carrying across the lot. Darius shook his head once. No, Major, minor abrasions. The bigger injury was to their careers. Holt and Blackwell shifted nervously, realizing a little too late just how deep they were in. The other military security officers quickly closed ranks around Darius, positioning themselves between him and the Riverdale deputies without even being asked. Patel turned to the local officers, stone-faced. You are hereby ordered to stand down pending federal investigation. Any further action on your part could be construed as obstruction of justice. Holt stammered, We didn't know who he was. That's not an excuse, Patel cut her off. You had documentation in your hand. You had everything you needed. Blackwell tried to play the tough guy. Still, he was acting suspicious. Patel stared at him for a long moment, then said quietly, You saw a black man on a phone call and made a choice that's going to follow you for the rest of your life. The military team efficiently bundled Darius into one of the SUVs, making sure he was seated comfortably inside. As the convoy pulled away, Darius glanced back once, just long enough to see Holt wiping her forehead with a trembling hand and Frank scurrying inside the station like a roach under a kitchen light. Inside the vehicle, Darius didn't say much. He stared out the window at the endless stretch of highway, his thoughts racing faster than the SUV. Major Patel broke the silence after a while. The White House is coordinating a full investigation, sir. Internal Affairs, Civil Rights Division. It's going public whether Riverdale likes it or not. Darius didn't nod. He didn't smile. He didn't flinch. They should have known better. he said simply. Patel nodded in agreement. They're going to find out what it feels like to be seen for who they really are. The convoy sped on past fields of tall pine trees and leaning telephone poles toward the military base, where Darius's authority and his dignity would finally be recognized again. But Darius knew the real battle was just beginning, and this time the whole country would be watching. News of the incident hit national headlines before Darius even finished his debrief at Oak Ridge. Someone had posted the cell phone footage online. Raw, grainy video showing 2 Riverdale deputies handcuffing a man who calmly explained he was a U.S. Army colonel. No shouting, no resistance, just the unmistakable look of someone being stripped of dignity by people too blinded by arrogance to see it. It spread like wildfire. By morning, Riverdale wasn't just a dot on the Oregon map anymore. It was the center of a growing national outrage. Networks ran the story on repeat. Commentators shook their heads in disgust. Civil rights leaders called it a clear case of racial profiling and abuse of authority. Even veterans organizations, usually careful not to wade into political waters, issued statements demanding justice for Colonel Reynolds. Back in Riverdale, the sheriff's department scrambled to do damage control. Sheriff Gloria Winters, a woman more familiar with managing small-town politics than handling press conferences, stood in front of a sea of cameras, sweat beading on her forehead. "We regret the misunderstanding," she stammered, avoiding eye contact with the reporters. "The deputies involved have been placed on administrative leave pending a full review." A young reporter from Portland cut her off mid-sentence. "Sheriff Winters, why were trained deputies unable to recognize military credentials clearly presented to them? Was race a factor in this so-called misunderstanding?" Winters stumbled over her words, muttered something about high tensions and mistaken identity, but everyone watching knew the department was cornered. They had no real defense. Meanwhile, Holt and Blackwell had gone radio silent. Their names leaked within hours, splashed across headlines, social media, and public outrage forums. Anonymous sources from inside the department revealed that both deputies had prior complaints. Excessive force and racial profiling swept neatly under the rug before. Not this time. Civil rights attorneys from Portland and Washington, D.C., filed official federal complaints on Darius's behalf, leading the Department of Justice to open an independent investigation. Even the Oregon governor weighed in, calling the incident an appalling miscarriage of justice against a national hero. It wasn't just about Darius anymore. It was about every person who had been doubted, dismissed, or degraded because of a uniform they didn't wear, a color they couldn't change, or an assumption they couldn't stop someone else from making. At Oak Ridge, Darius was briefed constantly. His lawyers, White House officials, and even a presidential liaison called for updates. He answered every question with the same steady voice he had used to command troops in war zones. But when he was alone in the quiet of his quarters, the weight of it pressed hard against his chest. Not because he was surprised, but because after all the medals, after all the service, after all the sacrifice, in a dusty parking lot in Riverdale, none of it had mattered. Still, he hadn't spent his life running from battles, and he sure as hell wasn't about to start now. But if Darius was going to speak, he knew he had to do it on his terms, not just for himself, but for every silent face watching him from the shadows. The press conference was scheduled for noon on a Saturday outside the gates of Oak Ridge Military Base. Cameras were already lined up in neat, frantic rows, microphones stacked 2 and 3 deep. Reporters murmured into phones. The air was crisp, clear, buzzing with a different kind of energy, the kind that meant something important was about to happen. Darius Reynolds stood behind the podium, wearing his full-dress uniform for the first time in months. Medals gleamed against the deep blue fabric. His shoulders were squared, his gaze unflinching. He wasn't here to entertain. He wasn't here to make anyone comfortable. Major Patel stood off to the side, arms crossed, watching protectively. A few senior White House officials flanked her, grim-faced. They had offered Darius carefully worded talking points, diplomatic phrasing, a safe path through the minefield. He politely declined. When Darius finally spoke, his voice was clear enough to cut through every rustle of wind, every click of camera shutters. "My name is Colonel Darius Reynolds," he began. "I have spent 26 years serving this country, leading soldiers, advising presidents, defending the ideals written into the Constitution. Yesterday, in Riverdale, Oregon, none of that mattered." He paused, letting the words hang in the clear air. "I was judged not by the content of my character, not by the uniform I've earned, but by the color of my skin and the assumptions made about me because of it." Reporters scribbled furiously, but Darius wasn't speaking for them. He was speaking to the people who had seen the video, who had felt a familiar pang in their gut, a sharp memory of being doubted, demeaned, or dismissed. "I'm not here today for an apology," he said. "I'm here because silence is not an option. Dignity matters. Respect matters. Human dignity matters. And none of these are negotiable based on someone's prejudice or someone's ignorance." Behind the cameras, members of the local community had gathered, black families, veterans, students holding handwritten signs. Darius caught glimpses of their faces, some angry, some hopeful, all of them waiting for something they hadn't seen enough of lately: real leadership. "Injustice is not new," Darius continued, "but change only happens when enough people refuse to look away." He finished with no dramatic flair, no rehearsed slogan, just the truth. "I was not humiliated yesterday. They were, and history will remember it that way." He stepped away from the microphone without waiting for questions. The applause started small, a few claps from the crowd, but quickly grew into something real, something alive. As he made his way back toward the base, Darius didn't walk faster or slower. He moved with the same steady pace he always had, one step after another, carrying more than just his own story on his back. Because he knew the world wouldn't change overnight. It might not even change in his lifetime, but maybe, just maybe, it would change a little because he refused to stay quiet. But the story didn't end with a press conference. It was only the beginning. 3 days after Darius's statement, a young black woman named Kiana Foster came forward. She had been pulled over by Deputy Holt 6 months earlier, handcuffed on the side of the road for matching a description, only to be released an hour later with no apology, no explanation. She had filed a complaint that disappeared into the bureaucratic void. Then came Miguel Sanchez, a Latino veteran who had been detained by Blackwell for suspicious behavior while waiting for his wife outside the local pharmacy. His military ID had been dismissed as fake, just like Darius's. Then Andre Wilson, a college student home for break. Then Layla Hassan, a nurse on her way to work. Then Victor Zhang, a business owner in the next town over. One by one, they stepped into the light, emboldened by Darius's refusal to be silenced. Each story was different, but the pattern was unmistakable. What had happened to Darius wasn't an isolated incident. It was just the first one caught on camera that couldn't be ignored. The Department of Justice investigation expanded, digging deeper into the Riverdale Sheriff's Department's history. They found deleted complaints, altered reports, a culture of looking the other way. Sheriff Winters' initial defense crumbled under the weight of evidence. Meanwhile, Darius received thousands of letters, emails, and messages from across the country. Some shared similar experiences, some offered support, some simply said thank you for giving voice to what they had felt but couldn't express. One letter in particular caught his attention. It was from a young cadet at West Point, a black woman named Imani Jackson. She wrote about watching his press conference, about how it had given her hope that the uniform she was working so hard to earn might someday truly protect her too. Darius read her letter twice, then picked up the phone. 2 weeks after the incident, Darius was invited to speak at West Point. The auditorium was packed with cadets, officers, and faculty, all standing at attention as he walked to the podium. This time, his speech wasn't about what had happened in Riverdale. It was about leadership, about the responsibility that comes with wearing the uniform, about the oath they all took to protect and defend the Constitution, all of it, for all people. The hardest battles, he told them, are not fought on foreign soil. They're fought in the quiet moments when you must choose between what is easy and what is right. They're fought when no one is watching, when there are no medals to be earned, when the only reward is knowing you stood for something greater than yourself. In the front row, Cadet Imani Jackson listened, her eyes never leaving his face. She saw in him not just a victim of injustice, but a leader who had turned that injustice into a catalyst for change. After the speech, Darius made time to meet with a small group of cadets, including Imani. They talked about their experiences, their fears, their hopes for the future. Darius listened more than he spoke, recognizing in their faces the same determination he had felt at their age. Before he left, Imani asked him a question that caught him off guard. "Sir, if you could go back to that day at the gas station, would you do anything differently?" Darius thought for a moment, then shook his head. "No, Cadet, because sometimes the world needs to see the truth, even when it's ugly. That's the only way it changes." Back in Riverdale, change was coming, whether the town was ready for it or not. The Department of Justice investigation concluded with a scathing report and a consent decree requiring complete overhaul of the Sheriff's Department's policies, training, and oversight. Sheriff Winters resigned rather than implement the changes. Deputies Holt and Blackwell were terminated and faced civil rights charges. Frank Mercer, the gas station owner who had made the initial call, found himself at the center of a boycott. Local residents, many of whom had been silent witnesses that day, now refused to patronize his business. Within months, Mercer's fuel and market was up for sale, and Frank was talking about moving to Idaho. But not everyone in Riverdale was resistant to change. A group of community leaders, including several who had witnessed the incident, formed a civilian oversight committee to work with the new sheriff. They organized town halls, listening sessions, and training programs aimed at building bridges between law enforcement and the communities they served. One of the most vocal members of this committee was a surprise to everyone: Trevor Blackwell's daughter, Olivia. A law student at the University of Oregon, she had watched the video of her father's actions with horror and shame. Rather than defending him, she had publicly condemned his behavior and committed herself to being part of the solution. "My father made a choice that day," she told the local paper. "Now I'm making mine." 6 months after the incident, Darius received an unexpected invitation. The new sheriff of Riverdale, Carmen Rodriguez, was asking him to return not as a victim, but as a consultant to help rebuild trust between the department and the community. Darius's first instinct was to decline. He had no desire to revisit the place where his dignity had been so casually stripped away. But after discussing it with his commanding officers and reflecting on what his response would mean, he decided to accept. His return to Riverdale was nothing like his first visit. This time he arrived in uniform, with an escort of respect rather than force. Sheriff Rodriguez met him at the county line, extending a hand and an apology that felt genuine rather than obligatory. The town had changed in subtle but significant ways. New faces in the sheriff's department, new policies posted publicly, new cameras on every deputy's uniform. New training programs designed with input from the communities they affected most. Darius spent 3 days in Riverdale, meeting with deputies, community leaders, and ordinary citizens. He didn't lecture or condemn. He listened, shared, and built connections. He visited schools, churches, and community centers, not as a symbol of what had gone wrong, but as a partner in making things right. On his last evening in town, he found himself back at Mercer's Snow, renamed Riverdale Fuel and Market, under new ownership. The new owner, a retired Army sergeant named Isaiah Bennett, had invited him for coffee. As Darius sat at the small table by the window, looking out at the same parking lot where he had been handcuffed months earlier, he felt something unexpected, not anger or resentment, but a quiet sense of purpose. Isaiah joined him, sliding a steaming cup across the table. "You know," he said, "when I bought this place, people told me I was crazy. That's where it happened," they said, like the ground itself was cursed. Darius nodded, understanding. "But I figured," Isaiah continued, "sometimes the best way to honor a bad memory is to build something better in its place." Darius looked around at the renovated store, at the community bulletin board covered with flyers for town meetings and youth programs, at the "All Welcome Here" sign prominently displayed by the door. "I think you might be right about that," Darius said, raising his cup in a small toast. 1 year to the day after the incident, Darius stood in the Oval Office, facing the President of the United States. Between them on the desk lay a piece of legislation, the Law Enforcement Accountability and Community Trust Act, nicknamed the Reynolds Act by the media. The bill, born from the outrage over Darius's treatment and fueled by the stories that followed, created new federal standards for police training, accountability, and transparency. It wasn't perfect, no legislation ever is, but it was a start, a foundation to build upon. "Colonel," the President said, "I want to thank you for turning a personal injustice into a national movement. Not everyone would have had the courage to speak up, or the wisdom to speak so effectively." Darius nodded, accepting the praise with the same quiet dignity he had shown throughout the ordeal. "Sir, I didn't do it alone," he replied. "There were thousands of voices that joined mine, many of whom had been silenced for far too long." The President picked up a pen, preparing to sign the bill into law. Well, today, those voices are being heard. As cameras flashed and history was made, Darius thought about all the people who had been part of this journey. Major Patel, who had stood by him from the beginning. Cadet Jackson, whose letter had reminded him why this fight mattered. The people of Riverdale, who had chosen growth over denial, and all those who had shared their stories, turning personal pain into collective power. He thought about how a single moment of injustice, captured on camera and refused to be ignored, had sparked a movement that couldn't be stopped. And he thought about all the work still to be done, all the battles still to be fought, all the changes still to be made. Because justice isn't a destination, it's a journey, and every step forward, no matter how small, matters. 5 years later, Darius Reynolds stood on the stage at West Point's graduation ceremony. Now a general, he had been invited to deliver the commencement address to the newest class of officers. Among the graduates sitting before him was Imani Jackson, no longer a cadet but a newly commissioned second lieutenant, her face beaming with pride and purpose. Darius looked out at the sea of faces diverse, determined, the future of the military and the country they had sworn to protect. He thought about how far they had come and how far they still had to go. "Leadership," he began, "is not about the rank on your shoulder or the medals on your chest. It's about the courage in your heart and the integrity in your actions. It's about standing up when it would be easier to stay silent, speaking truth when lies would be more comfortable, and recognizing the humanity in every person you encounter." He paused, his gaze finding Imani in the crowd. 5 years ago, I stood in a parking lot in Oregon, stripped of my rank, my dignity, my humanity. Today, I stand before you as living proof that a single moment does not define user response to it does. The audience was silent, hanging on his every word. As you leave here today, remember this. The uniform you wear is not just a symbol of the power you hold, but of the responsibility you bear. Wear it with honor, lead with compassion, and never be afraid to stand up for what's right, especially when you stand alone. After the ceremony, as the new officers celebrated with their families, Lieutenant Jackson made her way through the crowd to find General Reynolds. "Sir," she said, saluting crisply, "I just wanted to thank you. Your story, what you did with Itis, why I'm standing here today." Darius returned her salute, then extended his hand. "Lieutenant, the story isn't over. It's just beginning. And now it's your turn to write the next chapter." As they shook hands, a photographer captured the moment. The seasoned general and the new lieutenant connected by a shared commitment to something greater than themselves. The photograph would later hang in the West Point Museum, alongside artifacts from the Academy's long history. The caption beneath it read simply, "The past and future of leadership." But to those who knew the full story, it represented something more. A reminder that justice, like freedom, requires constant vigilance, unwavering courage, and the willingness to stand up when it matters most. Because in the end, it's not about the battles we choose, but how we fight the ones that find us. When you're treated unjustly, your voice is your greatest weapon. Speak the truth even when your hands are shaking. Someone out there needs the strength you show. If you believe in standing up for dignity and accountability, share this story. Speak up when you see wrong. Change starts with people willing to call it by its name.